Jim Ransom, a member of the board of the Historical Society, and welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion on the Homefront, Olympia during World War II. I hope you'll enjoy this afternoon as much as I know I will. Today we have three panelists that will be sharing their perspectives, slightly different perspectives each, on what it was like to be in Olympia during World War II. I'm going to give each of them about 10 minutes, and without taking questions, I think, unless you just can't stand it and you have to ask something. But then we'll have the balance of our time, hopefully at least half an hour, for any questions you may address to them, and or certainly any thoughts you might wish to add to the afternoon's discussion. So our panelists, please help me welcome them. Chief Justice Gerry Alexander is our youngest panelist. He was a grade schooler during the end of World War II. He did go on to Olympia High, as they all did, but I'll tell you more about him and his illustrious past soon. Second will be Bill Jacobs, who was a high school student during the end of the war, graduating class of 46. And as I think, yes. And then finally, Jim Brown, who graduated class of 41 and went off to fight the war, as probably all his able-bodied classmates pretty much did. So thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. I think we'll start with the youngest, if that's okay with everybody. And I don't really think Gerry needs a lot of introduction. He got his bachelor's from the University of Washington before then going off to the armed services. Eventually returned to the UW to get his law degree, and then after about 10 years of private practice, entered the judicial system, as they say, and worked his way up to the state Supreme Court, where he was Chief Justice for four-year stints in a row.
9 years as Chief Justice.
9 years, I'm sorry, okay. He was on the bench for that long in the Supreme Court. And only retired in 2011 because they made him at age 75. He's the longest jurist today of any in our state. Gerry was a grade schooler. I'm going to let him tell us more about what it was like in Olympia at that time.
Thank you.
And I've offered the opportunity to either stay seated or stand to our panelists, whichever they prefer.
Thank you, Tim, for that very kind introduction. I think I will stand. Maybe it's the legal training or something. As a lawyer, we had to stand, but as a judge, I could be seated. But I think I will stand. Let me first, can you hear okay back there, Mayor? Before I do anything, let me just thank everyone for attending. I think these are really exciting times that are about to happen for the Olympia Historical Society. And I, as a board member, just delighted to see so many people here today. I want to thank my fellow panelists, Bill and Jim, who are good friends, and thank them for being here as well. Don't be alarmed by the fact that I have this tablet here. You wonder how I might get through this in 10 minutes. I haven't filled all the pages, but I've had more fun getting prepared for this presentation than any I've made in a long time. I didn't have to do any research other than just to kind of search my own mind and go back to my childhood during World War II and jotted down a number of things that I want to mention to you. And a lot of these will have a ring to people in the audience looking around. By the way, it's not very often I get introduced as the youngest member of anything anymore. Let me just by way of background, just to refresh everybody's memory, although the Second World War really commenced in Europe in 1939, August of 39, when Germany invaded Poland, and then it went along for a while. It was kind of a period they called the Phony War. It heated up when the Germans invaded France and Norway, and then began the bombing of Great Britain. But the U.S. didn't officially come into the war until December 7th, 1941, as we all know, when the Japanese attacked our naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and at the same time attacked our bases in the Philippine Islands. And that's when we came into the war, declared war against Japan, and then a few days later, Germany declared war on us. So we were in it with both feet from that point on. Well, the United States had made some, I could see the war clouds gathering, and had made some preparations for war, but not as many as we probably should have. I don't have any real independent recollection of the attack on Pearl Harbor. I was 5.5 years old. We were then living in Aberdeen, and I'm sure it was talked about, but it doesn't really, I don't recall specifically anything about Pearl Harbor. We moved to Olympia in July of 1942, about 6 months after the war started. We came to Olympia like a lot of people who have come to Olympia because my dad went to work for state government for Governor Langley, for whom he worked for 12 years. And we moved onto Olympia's west side at 333 North Roger Street, just a block off Harrison, which in those days, Harrison was the main highway to, it was 101 to Grays Harbor and to around the peninsula. I drove by that house the other day, and it looks exactly the same as it did 70 years ago when we moved into it. Yeah. In September of that year, I started the first grade at Garfield School on the west side. Garfield in those days was both an elementary school and a middle school, 1 through 8. And I started up there. And I then really quickly became aware of the war and on the home front. We were a newspaper reading family. We took the PI in the morning, the Olympian, which was then an evening paper. We took that in the evening. We subscribed to Life magazine, which was the great picture magazine of the day, and the Saturday Evening Post. So you couldn't read any of that without learning about the war. And I've always been a newspaper reader, even when I was a little kid. And I remember later in the war, when I was a little older, the maps that would be on the front page of every paper with the little flag showing where the American Army was in relation to the British Army and the Soviet Army and the German Army and so on. I used to follow those maps with great interest. My dad was in his mid-30s when the war started, and he was married to my mother, and there were 2 children, my older brother and I. My younger brother was born in 1943, so my dad wasn't really high up on the draft list, although he did get drafted right toward the end of the war when they were scraping the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. But the war ended before he was actually had to report, so he didn't actually have to go in the service. But there were older men than he that served. His older brother was killed in the war, and then his other older brother was in the Merchant Marine, who wasn't able to get in one of the military branches, joined the Merchant Marine. By the way, the American Merchant Marine had a higher casualty rate than I think any of the other services. That convoy duty was really dangerous work, and he was in the Merchant Marine. My dad did, during the war, join what they called the State Guard. The Washington National Guard was nationalized and went in, I think became the 41st Division in the United States Army. And so they created a state militia, which was the State Guard, and so the older men would go down to the armory and march around, and happily never had to fight anybody. Let me say that even though the war was raging all around the world and really continued until August of 1945, when victory was finally achieved against the Japanese, the West Side neighborhood that I lived in and the Garfield School and my family provided a really nurturing environment for me and my brothers. I don't ever recall being anxious or frightened about the war, even though we knew and we used to talk about the possibility that Olympia could be bombed. And we now know, from a historical standpoint, that the Japanese had no ability or any interest, I'm sure, in bombing Olympia. But we, even if they had been able to, particularly after the great battle at Midway, when the United States Navy sunk 3 of the Japanese carriers there, there really wasn't any danger of that. But people didn't know that, and there was a lot of paranoia, I guess, about what might happen. I remember as kids sitting around talking about, if the Japanese bomb Olympia, what would they bomb? And we said, well, the Capitol building. They want to bomb the Capitol building. We finally agreed, because we lived in the West Side, they probably would want to bomb the West Side Bridge, which would prevent us from getting downtown. Heaven forbid, Jim, we'd have to go through Tumwater to get down to Olympia. And there was no road around the lake then. In fact, there was no lake. It was salt water there where the lake is now, and there was no road around, so you'd have to go out to Black Lake and around to get into Olympia if the bridge had been blown, but it wasn't. I remember my dad, some people in the room may remember my dad, he was quite enthusiastic about just about everything. And I remember in that house at 333 Rogers, and you can drive by it, it's on a hillside there, and the garage goes into the ground, and so the sides of the walls of the garage are actually underground, and with just the roof showing. And my dad said, that's going to be our bomb shelter. We're going to be in a Japanese bomb. And I remember, even as a little kid, I thought, Dad, it's got a wooden roof. What it would like? But he thought we'd be safe down there. I remember him talking about that. So what I'm going to do, I'm just in the remaining time, I hope I'm not going over time here, but I thought I'd just quickly give you some observations. This is through a child's eyes. I was 5.5 when the war started, 9 when and things that I observed that came back to me when I was just writing down these things. First one was air raid wardens. We probably had them in Aberdeen, but I didn't notice them. But when we came to Olympia, they were very noticeable to me. The air raid wardens were older men who wore a kind of a military-style helmet. I think it was kind of silver. And we had blackouts because they were concerned. They didn't want if the Japanese Air Force, and that's who we were worried about on the West Coast, not the Germans really. If the Japanese Air Force was to come over, we didn't want them to be able to see Olympia. And so all the street lights were out, and people had to draw their blinds tightly, and maybe even have to tape them so no light would emanate from the house. And these air raid wardens would go around the neighborhood with a flashlight, and if they could see light coming out a window or something, they would knock on the door and say, you better get that taken care of. And so I remember that, and that was sort of exciting, having them come to the house with their helmet, telling us to keep the light from showing. Another thing that I will never forget is war bond drives. I'm sure Bill and Jim will remember this as well. You know, the government had to finance this war. They did this by raising taxes and by borrowing. That sort of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Raising taxes and borrowing. And Americans, including kids, were encouraged to buy war bonds. Well, as a little grade school, we didn't have enough money to buy even a $25 war bond. They cost $18.75, I think, for a $25 bond that would mature 10 years later and be worth $25. But they did allow kids to participate in this. You could go to school, and if you had a quarter or a dime or a nickel, you could buy little stamps, and they had a booklet, and then you'd paste those stamps in there, and when you finally got $18.75 worth of stamps in there, you turn it in and you get a war bond. And there was competition among the schools, Garfield, Lincoln, Washington, Roosevelt, and so on. And they would announce periodically how much money, say, Garfield had raised. Let's say we raised $800 or $900. They would actually often bring a military item down from Fort Lewis. I remember they brought a Jeep down one time and told us, you bought this Jeep. And of course, we thought they took our $800, went to Detroit, paid for that Jeep and brought it out here. We bought that specific Jeep. But the one I remember the most, so this will be, can you imagine doing this today? They said, your money bought a bomb, and they brought a bomb down. It probably was a dummy bomb, I don't know, but it looked real to us, a blockbuster. And they brought it up on kind of a sled and said, you bought this bomb. And they gave us chalk to write on it, you know. As if, you know, the Japanese would be watching it come down and see the writing on it.
Gerry, it's about time.
Oh, is it? Okay.
I'm afraid so.
Really? I can't.
One more
I'm just kidding. Okay, one more minute. Okay. Let me say a word about rationing. And Andreessen, Jim Andreessen, is he back here? Is it Jim? Is it Jim? Ralph, I'm sorry. You have a ration card.
Yeah,
maybe later people want to look at that. Anyone who went through the war will remember rationing because there was rationing of certain foodstuffs, meat, sugar. My mother went to the store, she had a ration card, and she did have it. If it was filled up, but she wasn't entitled to sugar, then she wouldn't get sugar. Meat was rationed, coffee, I think, was rationed, butter, and gasoline was rationed. People got a sticker in their windshield, I think they were A, B, and C, depending on what your profession was, how much you would be allowed to get in the way of gasoline. People didn't do a lot of pleasure driving then because the gasoline, the foodstuffs, the military had a priority on it. I didn't come close to finishing here, but I'll sit down.
I don't think that too many people have had the questionable pleasure of cutting off the Chief Justice.
Okay.
Gosh, you got a lot more to go there.
I got a little bit more to go there.
There will be other additional opportunities.
Okay,
We'll have more time, but that would be fair to Bill and Jim.
Yeah.
And keep going. And I get away with this because of immaturity. I'm in fact the youngest at the table.
Okay.
I was a babe in arms during the times that we're talking about. Bill Jacobs, lifetime resident of the city of Olympia. He was at WWII as a high school student during the war. He graduated then from St. Martin's. He did serve in the Army later in Korea, and then went on into a very distinguished career in state service, working for Governor Evans in various capacities, including Chief of Staff when Evans went to the Senate, the United States Senate. He's then, since retirement, worked as the chair of the Western Institutional Review Board and is currently on the chair of the board of the Middleton Foundation. What was it like to be a high school student in Olympia during the war?
Well, first of all, the high school, for those of you who weren't around then, was on Capitol Way. And it was a 3-story brick building. And it was on the green grass now that covers the state archives, right across the street from the Capitol building. And behind the Capitol, or the Olympia High School, was a neighborhood. And the state government had not expanded to the other side of Capitol Way. So we kids went to that school, and it was the only high school in town, public high school. There was St. Martin's High School then, as there is now. But all the kids from all of the grade schools in town, the rural area, and so on, all flowed into that one school where we all got to know one another. And they had these big guys from the rural areas that always turned out to be a guard on the OHS football team. To give you a flavor of what it was like, and my age, I was more aware than Gerry was at his young age, more involved, and I looked up some yearbooks. We were so aware in high school that the war was raging. We were so aware of it. And in the 43 yearbook, when I was a freshman, and remember, it's the students at the school that make up the yearbook and do the writing in it, there was one phrase in it that said, every able-bodied senior boy was required to enroll in the commando PE workout. The War Department simply said, better get the boys in condition before they get in. So they all knew upon graduation where they were headed. In 1945, a couple years later, it said in the yearbook, the majority of the boys have entered, for the graduating seniors, the majority of the boys have entered or soon will enter the armed services, as may some girls. Many girls will be engaged in war work, doing the sometimes tedious and monotonous yet always essential tasks which face those on the home front. And we heard a lot about the home front and the war front. And you know, we all felt a part of what was going on. In my yearbook, 46, first class to graduate without the war raging, it said about the graduating seniors, they had come through the war years of high school with excellent records of social and academic endeavors, musical, dramatic, and journalistic efforts, and wartime contributions. Standing at the doorway of adulthood, ready to accept the challenge of a world in the aftermath of war. And so that was such a good feeling for those of us. And for me, the war started December 7th, 1941. I was in the 8th grade, and it was a Sunday, and I was outside playing with some friends, and my mother came to the door and said, "Come in, Billy, there's something going on." And the radio was flooding the news about what was happening in Pearl Harbor. Everybody turned to one another and said, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" We hadn't heard much about it. And what's going on? And it took a little while, like hours, for everyone to really realize that that bombing at Pearl Harbor meant the United States was entering World War II. And soon then, in grade school, I said I was in the 8th grade, we began having air raid drills. And we would hide under the desk. And why would they be bombing a grade school out there? We never knew, but we had grade school drills. And another thing I remember that has, to me, always been poignant. We would have, when I entered high school, special high school all-class assemblies. And the sole purpose of the assembly would be to honor former students of that high school who were now prisoners of war, or we just heard were missing in action, or had been killed in action. And what you thought about was a student sitting next to you at that assembly who was maybe a year older than you and was going to graduate that year. Would you be subject to that same thing? So you had a very close feeling. Our source of news, as Gerry said, was the newspaper, but also the radio. And one of the great stars of that time was Edward Armour. And he always introduced his programs, remember, he was in London, he was in England reporting on the war in Europe, and he'd say, "This is London." And you could hear the bombs in the background. And so he was in the middle of the war, and he brought it to us on the radio. And our heroes at that time were Generals Eisenhower on the European front and General MacArthur on the Pacific front. And a guy by the name of Ernie Pyle, who was a wire service reporter, who was known as a GI's reporter because he went in the foxholes with them and told their stories. And we did have rationing, and it was the Office of Price Administration that kept everybody from having huge price increases. There were shortages, and who remembers that you could no longer get butter, but you could get margarine, and you used that little thing that came with it to make the margarine yellow. There were housing shortages in Olympia because many families came out here to be with their soldiers who were stationed at Fort Lewis, and so duplexes were created, apartment houses were built, people rented bedrooms oftentimes to people that were here for their families. There were stars in people's windows as you'd go through a neighborhood, and it would show how many members of that family were in the service. And you always dreaded seeing a gold star because you knew what that meant. There were a lot of soldiers around, a lot of hitchhiking, and you always picked them up, and you took them wherever you were going. And if you were in Tacoma, which you had more than an A card if you were in Tacoma to get back to Olympia, gasoline rationing, you would usually invite them to, many people invited them to Sunday dinners, and they always accepted. And correspondence developed between those families and the soldiers that went on for years after the war. I see you're getting uneasy, aren't you?
No. I'm actually going to leave the table for a minute.
Well, I'm about ready to wrap it up, but there was a, there was a song made famous at that time, and it was sung by a big movie star of that day who was not noted as a singer. Her name was Betty Davis, and she sang, "They're either too young or too old." And how'd that line go, Pat? What?
They're either too gray or too grassy green. The pickings are small and the crops are lean. What's good is in the army will never, what's left will never harm me.
Yeah. That was us. We're what left. We'll never harm. We were singing things like "Sweet Dreams, Sweetheart," "Johnny Zero," That was a guy that went off and flew, and they called him Johnny. 0. And Mersey Dotes. Turn that to pen. And then we all had a sense of being part of it, as I said, because of the rationing, the shortages, knowing a member of neighbors, a member of the family that were in the service. And there was a famous quotation that we heard in World War II that said, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war." Lucky Strike packages were then green and white. And there was something in that green that could be used in the war effort, so Lucky Strike packaging became white instead of green. And something that never came back from World War II is that green. They never had that same packaging again. Why would I remember that? I don't know. And so I was in the 8th grade when it started, and I was riding in a grocery delivery truck, Rader's Grocery. Carl Rader, the co-owner of the store, was driving. He had the radio on, and it was announced that the war was over. And it was it was in summer of 1945, and I was about to enter my senior year of high school. And in those days, that's what you had, were local stores, neighborhood stores, downtown stores. There weren't any supermarkets. The closest thing to it was a place called the Piggly Wiggly down at a parking lot on Legion Way, what is now a parking lot on Legion Way. So when that news came in, Carl stopped the truck and he said, "I'm going over to St. Michael's to give thanks. You take the truck back to the grocery store." We'd completed our delivery. So I did, and as I was driving down Capitol Way, there were quite a few service stations, gasoline stations there at that time, and Roy Baker operated a Shell station. And as I looked over there, he was laughing, he was having the grandest celebration, and he was pumping gas out into the street. So, plenty of gas now. And then finished my senior year, and I went to Linfield College in McMinnville as a freshman. And you can still see the results of the war because all the returning GIs who had not completed their college were re-entering college. And I hadn't expected that. So you had your usual enrollees plus all these returning vets. And when we got there, they arranged for our housing, which was row after row after row of cots in the gymnasium. And ultimately, temporary barracks and that sort of thing came on. And now when you think about it, the youngest vet from World War II was probably about 85. And so it's a rapidly disappearing generation.
Thanks, Bill, very much. Our third speaker this afternoon is Jim Brown, lifetime resident of Tumwater and unofficial historian of that town. Jim was, as I said earlier, a graduate of Ole High School, class of 41, and went off to war. So we've asked him to speak from that perspective and from the fact that he was paying a little more attention than many to what was going on at the Olympia airport at that time, where some P-38s were being kept. And before I forget it, I want to do two things. One is that to mention that TCTV is here. Thank you very much for coming to allow us to get this on the television eventually. And if and when we get to questions from you all, I will be repeating those questions for that purpose. But again, to thank them. And I can't remember what the second thing was. So Jim, would you go ahead?
Well, you got to pardon me. I don't know whether I can stand up that long.
Stay where you are.
I got to tell you that between my cat and I, it tried to get the other side of the room by running through my legs, and my balance isn't the best. And the cat won because I ended up on the floor, and so I'm really not the best. I think I got a cracked rib out of it and a sore leg and sore muscles. So other than that, I think I'm going to live. But the other thing I want to tell the management of the of the Olympia Historical, I think they missed a bet. If I'd have been running this place, I'd have charged admission.
Thank you.
But then I was told by one of your board members, well, are you going to say anything about World War II? And are you going to talk just about the airport? And I said, well, I was told airport. He says, I think you should talk something about the World War II. So I'll start at Olympia High School. I graduated in 1941, and I was 17 years old. I wasn't 18 until January 3rd. In other words, a couple of weeks ago, then I was 18 years old. So I thought, well, I'm going to enlist, and I don't want to be drafted. So I found out that if you went in the submarine outfit, that you'd get more money per month. And I think it was $4, I'm not sure. But so then I got to talking, I think my dad and a couple others said, well, you're just out of your head to be thinking about the submarines, because he said, you're even scared to go upstairs in the dark. So anyway, so I enlisted in the Air Corps, and first thing you know, was on a train when going down to, I thought was a big base to take basic training. Well, I ended up on the fairgrounds at Fresno. Well, I said, what kind of a base is this? Well, we just putting things together. And so things were kind of very basic, except we did have a mess hall of sorts. I got to tell you a little story about that. I learned then and there, I did a lot of talking, and the mess sergeant come by, and he had a roll of toilet paper in his back pocket. And I said, Sergeant, and he come over, yes, soldier, it doesn't look very good with you walking around with that toilet paper hanging out of your back pocket. He said, oh, you don't like it? Follow me. That was my first time being on KP. Learned in a hurry. Well, anyway, and then the other thing I didn't like about basic training, we didn't have, it wasn't very sophisticated. When they said to fall down with your rifle, we were falling down on rotten watermelons and a bunch of other stuff that are out in the farmers' fields. I finally got through that. They sent me, they said, what do you want to, I said, I want to be a flyer. All my life I've been flying model airplanes, now I want to be the pilot of one. Okay, sign this. So I signed it. You got to take some tests. Okay, I took tests. He said, your right eye is weak. It's not strong enough. He said, you drink carrot juice for about the next few months and come back and take this test. You know, I think I still can't stand carrot juice. Didn't help my eye one bit. And he says, well, the next thing you could be a mechanic. But if you're a good mechanic, you could be an engineer. I said, okay, that's what I'll do. Well, they sent us on to Lincoln, Nebraska. And there again, I thought we were going to a camp. They sent us right into the middle of town into a great big automobile agency, and they had sheets in the windows, and we were sleeping in bunks behind those sheets. And there wasn't enough room, so the rest of us were sleeping upstairs over a mortuary. And then we didn't get a ride out to the air base where we were going to school. We had to walk. It was about 3 miles, so they made us run. And that's even worse. So I got through that and went to Texas. The only place in the world where you can be up to mud up to your neck and have sand blow in your face. I would never want to live in Texas. And so I spent a lot of time talking about with some other fellows who were there, ways to get out of there. So I signed up for the paratroopers. They had beautiful boots, and I didn't make it. So I signed up for this, signed up for that. I finally, I hit what they call ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program, where you could go in, finish your schooling, be a doctor or engineer or something. So they sent me up to Texas A&M, and I thought, gee, this is a wonderful school, got some beautiful girls, but Texas A&M was all boys when I was there. So I was there just long enough to get acquainted and get sent from there right back up to Lincoln, Nebraska at university. And the only thing I can remember about being there was the miler from the Olympic Games. He had his legs burned as a child and became a miler, and he was a champion. Somebody can remember his name, I don't remember it. But anyway, I was there for a while, and first thing you know, they said, we're moving you. Sent us all the way to Rhode Island to go to Rhode Island State. There we were in seventh heaven because there must have been 500 young girls waiting for us to get off the train because the rest of everybody's in the Army. So that was wonderful, we thought. Except they marched us to our barracks and said, you're confined to your barracks. But I'm not done traveling yet on the ASTP. I'm trying to get an education. All they were doing is transferring us around. Then they sent me to Athens, Ohio, and finally I went to school. Then they said, okay, we're running short of soldiers someplace in the world, so everybody that's in this program is going to have to go in the infantry. Well, so I went down the line, and they said, oh, wait a minute, your MOS, isn't that what they used to say, MOS? Your MOS says that you've got this training, so we're going to send you back to the Air Corps. So I went to the Air Corps, and they said, okay, we're going to put you in a night fighter outfit. Well, what do they do? Well, you're going to be in this plane that's going to go like this at night, and this fellow's going to fly behind you, and he's going to try to shoot you down. And in fact, how much time I got?
You got a couple of minutes, but can you tell us a little bit about what was going on?
I still got an hour and a half yet before I get out of the Army.
Well, then don't cut it short.
Okay, we'll forget that, but I got to tell you that I finally ended up in a B-17 because I got so sick. And B-17s go like this. And I was in seventh heaven really. And then I qualified as an engineer, and we used to get these young pilots. They knew how to fly, but they didn't know anything else about if the motor would run or not run or how or whatever. And so I was in that for a couple of years. Then I was sent to South Pacific. I was in the middle of the South Pacific, going from one island to another, and ended up in the Army occupation in Japan. And I had a younger brother who was doing the same thing, except he was in artillery, going from Guadalcanal all the way up through to the Philippines. Okay, Olympia Airport.
Were there were P-38s there, is that right?
Yeah, P-38s, and everybody how many people remember P-38s crashing? Oh, okay, everybody remembers that. And there was one of them, what they say, glanced off the corner of St. Peter's and landed in there. Another one landed, it would be what is an I-5 now over in East Olympia. But two of them came to, their wings tipped together and they parachuted out. One of them lit into a little pothole right between Peter G. School and the river, and there was a small lake, and he lit in the lake, and the other one lit on the land. They got out alive, and then another one lit when he crashed right where Peter G. is today. And you want to go ahead and show that. I'll show you something that the Army did. I made a little sketch, and it's from memory and out of scale, but I think it gives a little, if I can see it.
Be there in a second.
I'll give you a minute. Okay, where's my cane? The one thing that happened, the first thing when I was in, I must have been a junior, senior, sophomore. The next thing I heard that here is, okay, Israel Road, here, and here's the City Hall, and the high school. You kind of got your, kind of know what you're looking at, all right? This road right here goes those went right through the middle of the field, went right on down to Deep Lake. All right, they closed that off, and you had to go around to get to Deep Lake. But on on there was where I got the West Farm, a man by the name of A.G. West who put, I think it was 42 years on the school board for the Tumwater School District, lived there, and they bought his home. They bought another one from the Oaks family, and two of his kids, Donald Oaks was in my high school class, and Mary Jane West was in my high school class and grade school also. And then there was another fellow who was a year ahead of us in school named Billy Richenthaler, I think, and then several other families that were bought out, and that road closed off, and then they put those revetments in, and on all the revetment is just a big high pile of dirt in a circle, and they put the plane in there as for protection. And now those are really the highlights, and I do have what the word is, I think, plagiarized from some of Shana's work. During those days, when there were two squadrons on the field, and one of them was enlisted men that were training the officers. But this Gladys broker and her and her husband had a business there of teaching young men to fly, and they formed a company with a man named Gwynn Hicks. And this Gwynn Hicks, incidentally, his relatives at one time had about 25 or 30 acres on Hicks Lake, and he's related to that Hicks. But anyway, according to what's written on this, they opened the Broker Hicks flying service for the civilian pilot training program located at St. Martin's. Gladys was ground school instructor for all male school from 1939 and 1941, and after Pearl Harbor, the P-38s from McCord Air Force Base located at the Olympia Airport, and the Broker Hicks operation moved into Pasco. Now those are really the high points, and I didn't see a lot of that because some of it I went in the Army right away, so I talked to other people to find out a lot of these things.
Well, great, Jim. Thank you very much. As promised, I want to open the floor to, we can have the light, yes. Open up the discussion to others on the floor. I just sort of feel stories on the waiting to be told. But start with ask whether you have any questions to direct to our panel. Sir.
Now, when did the Army abandon the Olympia Airport?
Directed to Jim, when did the Army abandon the Olympia Airport?
Well, I understood it was in 41 according to this paper right here, but I don't know. Shauna, is that correct?
I think they moved them all inland
Yeah.
after the beginning of the war.
Oh, okay.
I did some research online, and according to this, P-38s were only at McCord Field for about 1 year, and their purpose was to defend the shipyard and Boeing. And of course, they were dispersed from McCord. They were here at Olympia, they were in Shelton, they were in Everett, and so forth. So then, I've got a history of the 55th Fighter Group here, and there's a good long paragraph about their history, but most of it's about their P-51 operations in Europe in combat. So the part of it where they're defending the Pacific Northwest and Olympia gets about 2 sentences. But the other part of the research, you can go online to the P-38 Association, and Jim was just talking about the crashes, and I've heard some of the stories about the crashes too. But they've done a serial number search of all the P-38s that were stationed in Olympia. And during this 1 year period, 42 to 43, before they went overseas to Europe, there were 14 crashes and 8 pilots were killed.
Thank you, Chuck.
Yep.
I know as a kid on the west side, that was probably the most exciting thing that happened during the war on the west side was that P-38 that clipped the old St. Peter Hospital, which is at the top of 4th Street, Hospital Hill as we used to call it. And, you know, but I think in those days they didn't spend a lot of time talking about it after they cleaned everything up and they had a war to fight, and off they went. There wasn't a lot of investigation into it.
When I'm talking to some of the old timers, they said that the P-38s were brand new, very high-powered aircraft. There was a lot of aerobatics and hot dogging by those young pilots with those very powerful aircraft. And so as a result of that, it was a lot for actors.
We do have another question.
Do any of you remember Victory Gardens?
Yes.
Question is about Victory
So where were
Gardens.
they located?
I was gonna mention that, the Victory Gardens, people had them in their own backyards oftentimes, and then a neighborhood would have some common area in a neighborhood where they'd all pitch in and have it. And they grew in their Victory Gardens produce for their own use because of shortages in grocery stores. And the war effort, the country encouraged people at home to plant your Victory Garden. Yeah. So I had them many had them right in their backyard.
I never got to it in my.
Go to it, Gerry.
I had Victory Gardens written down because, right after rationing, because they did encourage people to grow their own food. You know, on the west side, the soil there's a lot of clay up there on the west side. It wasn't really very good for growing vegetables, but we did the best we could. The south end and out on the Elm Highway, it's kind of a sandy loam. It's really good agricultural land. The west side is not as good, but we tried. And we had a garden in our yard.
Yes, sir. In
Can
the
you
back.
talk a little bit just about the growth of Fort Lewis? You know, how was Fort Lewis, what was going on there at this time? You mentioned the soldiers hitchhiking and so forth. What else did you remember about Fort Lewis at this time?
Well, I got to tell you that I hitchhiked all the way from Florida to Tumwater. It took me 7 days. I thought I could get home in a day and a half, but the first time I got on a plane, it flew up to New York, and then I had to find a way out of New York, and I thought I'd head west. And the next time I got on a plane, it flew back to Louisiana. And then finally I got on a fighter plane and started flying west, and about out in the middle of nowhere, he said, you know, we got a bad hydraulic leak. We're going to have to make an emergency landing. I thought, oh boy, we've had it. But instead of what happened was, he says, well, according to my map, there's an emergency field here. We'll land on that. Well, we got to the field. Here was a sheep herder, had a herd of sheep on it. So he buzzed the field, and then we went around. The guy chased the sheep off, and we landed, and we waited and got somebody to come in and repair the plane. Went on all the way to North Island and San Diego, and I saw my first Jap Zero. They got it from Alaska, I think, or Attu or wherever, somewhere up in there. That's my story.
Thoughts about Fort
Could I
Lewis?
say that was also on my list. I'm really glad you asked that question. I wanted to talk about the military presence that I saw as a kid. There were always a lot of soldiers from the fort down here in Olympia. And I think during the war, soldiers were required to wear their uniform. I don't think they kept civilian clothes in their locker like they do today. And so they were present. There was a USO in town, which is it's in the block just east of the Daily Olympian, or the Olympian building there. And later, after the war, it was purchased and became the Olympia Community Center. It was the community center for years. That was the USO. I remember going through Fort Lewis as a kid, and the old Highway 99 ran just exactly where the freeway is through Fort Lewis. And I can remember as a child seeing, early on in the war, corrals with horses in them. And I've often wondered, I think they were phasing out, there were still cavalry units, I think, up until the war, and I think they were phasing them out. But the most memorable thing about Fort Lewis that I recall was we were driving through there one time with my dad, and there were a bunch of men in dungarees picking up papers, litter along the highway and so on. And I said to them, and they had on the seat of their pants, in red paint, it said POW. And I said to my dad, who are these people? He said, they're Italians that had been captured in North Africa, and they brought them back to the States on troop ships where they took troops over and they would bring them back. And there were Germans and Italians kept at Fort Lewis and at Fort Lawton in Seattle. The Italians, it didn't appear to me they were guarding them very carefully. They were not anxious to get back in the war. I think they sort of you know, Italy was never very an enthusiastic part of the Axis powers like the Germans were. So I don't think they watched them very closely. There may be some of them still living up in Lakewood. I don't know. But, anyway, I do remember that was exciting to see these prisoners of war.
Carla?
I was just wondering if any of you had any experience with Japanese Americans in your school that you saw, that you knew, and what happened to them, your reaction.
Bill, you might know.
The question is about whether anyone knew or had Japanese students in their school and knew what might have happened with them.
You know, that's an interesting question because I don't think we realized the seriousness of that until after the war. The only visual memory I have of that is seeing Japanese families and individuals entering buses down at the Greyhound bus depot, where it is today. And sometimes I'd be by there on a bicycle or walking. And when that would happen, and they were smiling, I wasn't quite sure what would happen. I'd wave, and they'd wave back. And it wasn't publicized, it wasn't in the paper, and we didn't ask questions, and we really didn't know. And I don't remember, in the time I was in school, other Japanese students. Remember, Japanese families were Japanese restaurants in town, and they went to school earlier. Tony K comes to mind. But that's the only memory I have of them is on a Greyhound bus leaving town.
Charlie?
Responding to that question, I remember I'm 10 years old in 1942, and we went out to the Puyallup fairgrounds. My folks had friends who were Japanese, and we went out and visited and talked to them through the fence. But the other thing is, I may regret doing what I'm about to do. But Bill, those songs,
Yeah.
I want you to join with me. You remember Spikes Jones and the City Slickers?
Oh yes, yeah, that was very
Okay,
good.
you ready?
Oh, no, I can't remember the song.
I'll quote you. Not to love the Fuhrer is a great disgrace, so we have slammed right in the Fuhrer's face. Hitler's world, new order. Hitler's world, new order. Now, do you remember?
I remember it very well.
Hey, Charlie, now I want to hear you sing Mersey Dogs.
Don't encourage it, please.
Charlie, I knew Spike Jones and you're no Spike.
Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, actually, this is to Mr. Alexander, or Judge Alexander. I remember as a little kid, younger still, they had these cartoons on TV with monkeys that were supposed to be Japanese soldiers operating machine guns and flying planes. And I was terrified. I still remember it. Did you ever see that when you were a little kid in the movie theater?
Well, I know I think a lot of the depictions of the Japanese during the war were, I mean, I think you'd have to say today were quite racist. I know in the comic books that they always had the Japanese portrayed as really small with always with glasses and buck teeth and really yellow skin. And in the movies, they weren't portrayed quite as favorably, but pretty close. I was gonna mention that. You know, the entertainment industry really did a lot in terms of developing the patriotic fervor that enveloped the United States during the war. And we used to, some of the movies, you know, John Wayne, he hung up his spurs and his cowboy hat and became a military man all during the war in these movies. And we used to say John Wayne won the Second World War single-handedly. And movies like The Flying Tigers, Back to Bataan, and there was other movies, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, and some of them actually were pretty decent movies.
Fighting
But
CBs.
the Fighting CBs, exactly, and those movies were shown at the 3 movie theaters in town, the Capitol Theater, which is still there on the 5th, the Liberty Theater, which is where the Washington Center is now, and then the Avalon Theater for the real old timers, which was down on 4th Street, and you could go to those movies on Saturday for a dime, and you got the movie, maybe even 2 movies, a double feature, short subject, favorite being the Three Stooges, of course, and then newsreels and previews of coming attractions. Those were. But in answer to your question, I think we'd be a little embarrassed today to look at one of those old comic books. I don't remember the one with the monkeys which you're talking
No,
about.
it was a cartoon.
Yeah.
And I assume it
I
must
think-
have been shown in a movie theater.
I think the point is well taken, and there was a lot of propaganda in movies, and the kind of thing that we look back on now, not particularly proud of. But I think it's interesting to note, and factual to note, that it was easy at that time to propagandize because people heard and read about the Bataan Death March, where hardly anyone survived that. And there was great brutality on that march. And you heard the same thing about things that happened in the European theater with the Gestapo, and the German Gestapo. And there was great brutality that did occur. And so in order to illustrate that, as happens in so many fields, you kind of overemphasize it. And the goal, of course, was to support the war effort and end the war as soon as you could.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wondered, was there prejudice and suspicion about German families and kids with German names that went to school?
I can remember an Italian family that lived a few blocks away from us, and they were concerned that the same thing was going to happen to them, that it was happening to the Japanese. I never heard that from German families, but those kinds of things were considered, but that didn't happen.
I think the feelings about Germans Americans were not as pronounced as they were in the First World War. If you read in the First World War, I think a lot of German Americans did sustain prejudice, but I don't remember any. I mean, after all, who was the commanding general of the American? General Eisenhower. I think that's a German name. I don't think that was really prevalent in World War II against people who had a German-sounding name or who a German ancestry. But I am a history reader, and I think there was quite a bit in the First World War.
And the Germans didn't attack us either, the Japanese.
That's right. They did declare war on us because they were allied. They were in the Axis with the Japanese. But, you know.
We're at the end of our allotted time, but Susan has been very kind to let us keep going, so we will for a little while. And there's a question in the front.
Well, the reserve fleet, was that a post-war phenomenon?
Post-war, yeah.
The question was about the reserve fleet, which turned out to be a post-war.
You know, I did want to mention, though, for Chuck, because he's the naval, interested in the sea, we've talked about the Army, but the naval, there was a naval presence in Olympia from time to time. They would bring ships in, and there were tours. We couldn't get the really big ships that would go in, like the big aircraft carriers and battleships could go into Bremerton for repairs, but they did, I remember they used to bring these escort carriers with the United States. It was a small carrier, they called them baby flat tops. I remember going at the port of Olympia, going on and having an opportunity to visit one of those ships, the baby flat tops. So there were naval ships in Olympia from time to time as a goodwill gesture.
Sir,
Yes, I grew up on the west side in Garfield Grade School.
would you stand so that everybody can hear you?
I went to Garfield Grade School about the same time as Gerry Alexander, and I came today just to make sure that whatever he told you was
How'd I do?
So far, he's right on spot. But I remember at the end of the war, the day it was over, that everybody in town went downtown to celebrate. I was wondering if you or Bill happened to go downtown and you could tell us what that was like. If you didn't go, you did there.
Well, oddly enough, on that day in August, my grandfather our family came from Aberdeen, as I mentioned earlier. My grandfather wanted to go down to Aberdeen and visit a bunch of his friends. So we caught the bus at the bus depot, the Greyhound bus depot, which is still there. And I was on Main Street of Aberdeen when the war ended. And at that time, Aberdeen had a lot of mills, a lot more mills than they have today. And all of a sudden, the mill whistle started going off. People started, cars had running boards, remember that? People started jumping on other people's running boards and driving through town honking horns. And I'll always remember that moment. It's like you never forget what you were doing in an earthquake, right? In 49 or 65 or 2001. And I remember that, but I was in Aberdeen that particular day visiting. I wasn't in Olympia.
I don't even remember taking the truck back to the grocery store. But I must have joined some friends and celebrated. But I did want to comment about the naval presence. And many of you know a good friend of mine, George Meyer, who lived in Olympia for a long time. He grew up in Bremerton. And there are a lot of people that moved out here, a civilian population, to work in the shipyards and the naval yards in Bremerton. And I remember George telling me that there was such an influx of people in the high school in Bremerton, I think they only had one there, that they did 2 shifts of students. So you'd have one shift come in and do their entire school sessions, and then they would leave and the second shift would come in. So you'd have kids that would be in the same school, same class, and never meet. So.
Jim, did you have a comment?
Well, when you talked about the end of the war, I had quite a story about it. I was stationed, when the war ended, I was stationed on the island of Tarawa, and that was a horrible place where the Navy, we attacked this little island. It was only 1.5 miles long and a mile wide. Had 4,000 or 5,000 Japanese entrenched, and they bombed it for quite a while. Then they tried to land the troops, and the tide, you might say, was low, and the landing boats couldn't get in, so they had to wade, and we lost, through getting killed and wounded, we lost 1,500 men right on that landing beach. So anyway, I was on the ATC, that's Army Transport Command, hauling troops and supplies, and we were stationed on that island. So one day I had nothing to do. I went around and I drew all of the Japanese installations and where they had their machine guns and a couple of boats that we'd sunk that belonged to them, and they had some artillery they'd gotten from Singapore on the island. And anyway, then I drew where the Japanese, most of the 4,000 or 5,000 were buried underneath the airstrip. Then the Americans we had 3 small graveyards for the Americans. But anyway, dropping that for a second and going, when the war ended, we didn't know it, but our commanding officers said, I want everybody to come out and stand, attention, ranks or whatever they call it. And then it was, so we were all standing there, and the first thing he said was, I have never seen such a lousy bunch of soldiers in my life. He said, nobody's got a uniform on, your sleeves are cut off at the shoulders, you got what they call the pants that are cut off, and you're not wearing army shoes. And he says, I want you to go back and dress in your army uniform, and you give us so much time to get dressed and get back out there. And when we were standing in at attention, then he said, the war is over.
Other questions, sir? And would you stand? Yes, sir.
Do you have any recollection of the atomic bomb when that fell?
Well, I was in Japan for 6 months. They immediately went to Japan, and I was going to go over to, I think it was Hiroshima, and take a look, but they didn't want anybody around there at the time, so I never did get on the site. But I did see that it was very obvious to me that the military in Japan for generations had had their thumb right on the neck of every single person in Japan.
Jim, I'm going to ask you to keep your
cane off the table. Remember, there's the microphone.
Okay.
Other thoughts about the bomb?
I remember, that was August of 1945, and I had been up at the playground there at Garfield School, what they used to call the lower field, and I came home and my mom told me that we had dropped this bomb on Japan. And I think, I mean, I'm sort of conflicted on this because at the time I thought that was good. I mean, I think we thought it was going to bring about the end of the war, which it did, and after the second one was dropped. But, you know, from this vantage point, looking back, all the people that died that day in Japan, and the Japanese are good people. They had a terrible leadership of their government, totalitarian leadership. But I do think, from a historical standpoint, it did cause the Japanese to surrender. I don't think they would have done it perhaps without that, because they wouldn't surrender in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and I think it did bring about the war, as terrible as the damage it wrought. So,
Well, that's a memory I have of it, is that I remember we all were surprised that it happened, and we all were aware that the war was ending sooner than everybody had anticipated. I remember that feeling of that.
One more question? Yes, sir.
Back to Olympia during the war years. Do you recall any businesses or industries that had to pretty much be shuttered because either the people who ran them were off at war or the materials were not available for that industry because of shortages?
You know, that was in Gerry's notes as well. One of the things that we enjoyed in high school during those years was it was so easy for a kid to get a well-paying job. And because they didn't have the young people at home that would ordinarily fill those jobs. And so a lot of businesses survived by hiring high school kids in the summer and after school. And the high school kids loved it because they were making far more than they would ordinarily. I don't know of any businesses being shuttered. I know a lot of people would seek out work that would give them deferments if they had a family, you know, and they would drive up to Tacoma and Seattle for the shipyards. But that was a plus. Remember, the last job I had in high school was driving a dry cleaning truck. A lot of delivery services went on at that time. And I remember a veteran who had just returned stopping me and saying, "I hear you're going to go to college in the fall." And he said, "I want to put in my application for that job."
you didn't cover everything that was in my notes. So. I think one type of business that was really affected by the war were automobile sales, because there were no passenger automobiles manufactured in the United States. I think a few in 1942, but that had already come out in late 41, 42 models. But after that, all the automobile companies were making tanks. Ford was making B-24s on what had formerly been a automobile line. So there were no car sales. Now I think those car companies got by maybe selling used cars. You couldn't get tires. Remember, tires back in those days had inner tubes, and people would try to make those tires last for the duration, and they'd get the inner tube out and they'd be all patched up and put it back in there. I think that's when they first started doing retreading of tires, and the first ones were not very good, and people would be driving down the road and all of a sudden the tread would come off. So I think the automobile sales companies were affected.
Well, they did okay, because if you said the used cars, and of course the price of used cars stayed steady and were inflated because it was hard to get them.
What was going on with the brewery at that time?
They were making beer out there. I think
Did they open a brewery?
Yeah,
to
I think-
celebrate?
They hired a lot of ladies.
Yeah, and didn't they ship a lot of beer to the South Pacific during the war?
Well, they did. The brewery did just fine because they had, you know, it hadn't been too distant past where it was hard for people to find jobs. So there were still a lot of middle-aged people that were not subject to the draft. and they found jobs at the brewery. And there were some more opportunities for women than had existed before, but they went along just fine and they did well. So.
Well, believe it or not, Gary's put his notes away. I think it's time for us to give our panel a chance to relax and to thank them for this wonderful. Before you go, President of the Society of Art College would like to speak briefly.
Well, I've been to a lot of presentations at the Coach House, but I have to say, this has been the most enjoyable and engaged in both ways of presentation I've been to. And I want to thank you all. Of course, Justice Alexander and these other two folks have had a great career in public service. Sometimes it was short. Bill Jacobs was the Olympia City Commissioner for a term, was it?
Yeah.
Term. And of course, Jim Brown. Were you on the Tumwater Council also?
Well, I put two terms. I ran for election 8 times and was never defeated.
Plus, on the Tumwater School Board many years. So thank you again for all.
By the way, I still have more in my notes. I'd be happy to come to people's homes.
When did you first realize you lost control?
Well, you notice how he got a chance to say everything he wanted to say.
Well, on a more serious note, I'd like to offer the viewpoint of a young soldier who came here and was hosted in Olympia and so on. My late father, his Illinois National Guard Division was called to federal service in March of 1941. In the fall of 42 through about the spring of 43, they were stationed at Fort Lewis. He was a musician, a bandsman. They played for President Roosevelt's visit at Fort Lewis. He said that people in Olympia would invite soldiers home for dinner, for Thanksgiving, things like this. You could catch a bus down from the fort. He also, in his spare time, would chip rust up at the Tacoma shipyards, or go to Seattle and report in at Musicians Union Hall. One night he might be playing under Sir Thomas Beecham with the symphony, and the next night at the Burlesque House. It was all good. So I asked him, how did you get around all this? He said, I hitchhiked. He said, anybody would pick up a soldier in those days. So in 1989, when he came to visit, we went around some of the places on Olympia, and I took him out to Fort Lewis to see the place. And it was a nice bit of nostalgia. So on behalf of my family, I want to thank Olympia and its families and for being a great host. And thank you, Tim, for organizing this. Thank you all for coming. It's been a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Remember,